ביקש מלאה אמו ללמד אותו תפירה, ורקם בעצמו על רצועת הנשק את המילים עוז וענווה.
احنا بندفع ضريبة القدس، هاي شبابنا، هاي عنواننا.
Good evening. You're watching I-24 News. I'm Lucy Arish, and this is day 28 of Operation Protective Edge. According to reports just in, Palestinian militant groups are claiming that there will be a ceasefire in the coming hours. There is no confirmation from any other source. Reportedly, Egypt said there must first be a 3-day ceasefire before negotiations can begin. Meanwhile, the IDF announced that one of the main missions of Operation Protective Edge, destroying Hamas's tunnel, is being completed. Nevertheless, rockets continue to fly out of the Strip. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the operation would continue until calm returned to Israel. And today, some of the attention shifted from Gaza to Jerusalem, which saw 2 terror attacks in a matter of hours. First, and East Jerusalem Palestinians rammed a tractor into a bus in the center of the city, killing 1 person, and then later a gunman shot and wounded an Israeli soldier on Mount Scopus. And with me here in the studio to discuss all these matters are Alon Pinkas, the former Israeli Consul General in New York. Good evening. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Lucy. Pleasure.
And also Richard Camp, no need to introduce, former commander of British troops in Afghanistan. Good evening. Good to have you both here. Alon, where are we headed diplomatically from here? If the jihad reached to a point, jihad and Hamas reached to a point that they're saying that ceasefire will occur in a few hours, it means that Israel won the battle?
No, but it didn't lose either, and then this is where it becomes kind of tricky. Israel can register some significant tactical successes, yet strategically nothing has changed. The equation remains the same. One of the problems is, and this leads to the diplomatic effort, one of the problems is that the concept of deterrence, as we know it, as we define it, as we apply it in a Western rational mode, does not work with, or is inapplicable when it comes to Hamas. When you cannot deter someone who's undeterrable, who's unwilling to be deterred, who is not amenable to be deterred. This idea that Hamas will crumble, will get on its knees once they see the devastation in Saj'iyah and other places, they will understand, or there will be grassroots pressures on them. That's nonsense.
Yes,
that won't happen, did not happen, and which is why the diplomatic effort is going to be something along the lines of what they call an arrangement, an accommodation, rather than a long-term, durable scenario solution.
Before I will continue in asking you if we're back to the starting point of this entire operation, I want to go live to Sderot in the south of Israel, where our I-24 News correspondent Eli Ochenberg is standing by. Good evening, Eli. So, Eli, rockets still are being fired from the Gaza Strip towards Israel, and it's not a calm night also in Sderot.
Yes, Lucy, it was a very eventful day, so some might forget that this day began with a unilateral ceasefire on Israel's behalf, with no activity in the Gaza Strip from 10 a.m. until 5 p.m. But again, as you said, the rocket fire towards the southern cities and communities continued all throughout the day, and this twilight time is very, very tricky because on the one hand, some people almost can smell the end of this operation, but on the other hand, they are still caught in this vicious reality when they need to seek for shelter several times a day. The red siren alerts are going off in the cities and towns here. So it's a very, very tense situation here. And while touring the southern cities today, Defense Minister Moshe Yaalon yet again promised the southern residents that the tunnel threat threat will be completely vanished by the time this operation will be over. But we could hear voices here from the southern residents that are pretty skeptical regarding the ending point of this operation. They were promised that both the missile threat and the underground tunnel threat will be completely destroyed. But as for now, they are not sure that this will indeed be the situation when this activity will be over. So a very tense evening here. It's also the eve of Tisha B'Av, one of the annual mourning days of the Jewish people. So the residents of Sderot here are at their houses, beginning to fast at the moment. So it looks like a ghost town, actually, Lucy. So a very tense day here in southern Israel, when the residents are still hoping to hear a concrete decision from the political level, and we'll, of course, keep you updated throughout our special edition tonight.
Of course, Ellie, thank you very much for this. Colonel Camp, is it a good or smart strategic move to just end this current operation right now?
Well, I think it effectively puts us in a similar position to the position that we were in at the beginning. So despite the loss of a very large number of Israeli military lives, a large number of Palestinian civilian lives, and hopefully a significant loss of a number of Hamas lives, despite all that, you know, what we've seen a lot of destruction, but have we actually seen any real change to the position of Hamas in relation to Israel? And I would argue that the answer is probably no. Now, whether that means you could have done it differently, whether the Prime Minister could go on and take greater action to crush Hamas, which would involve, in my view, a significant long-term ground offensive and would cost a great deal more lives, is another question. That's something that, you know, of course could happen, but at a huge price. I think the ideal position now would be for the international community to find some way of, as the Prime Minister here has asked and as the EU have also endorsed, demilitarization of the Gaza Strip. Easier said than done, and given the international community's track record at actually taking any form of action which has a positive effect in Gaza, I suspect that the answer to that probably isn't going to happen.
And of course, the international community is another arena that the Israeli Prime Minister needs to face right now. And just let's take a look about what happened today. And now let's see how the day unfolded. I-24 News correspondent Uri Shapiro reports.
The situation in the Middle East continues to entangle. A day after Israel began pulling some soldiers out from the Gaza Strip, fighting is still continuing. On Monday, Israel announced a 7-hour humanitarian ceasefire, but both sides accused each other of continuing the violence during the truce.
The breaking of the truce by the occupation, after it was announced from their side, and targeting Palestinian families and houses minutes after the truce started, that shows the lies of the occupation about the humanitarian truce.
Jerusalem saw 2 terror attacks. In one, a tractor driver rammed into a bus, fatally wounding 1 person and injuring several others. In the other, an assailant on a motorbike shot and severely wounded a man near the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Israeli Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman, meanwhile, spoke to a parliamentary committee, suggested for the first time an international monitoring in Gaza as a possible option to end the crisis.
We've seen UN mandates working, and working not badly in some places. Here too we should consider handing the mandate management and control of Gaza to the UN. I definitely don't negate it.
And in the meantime, the international efforts to end the crisis continue. Palestinian sources said today that the U.S. renew its negotiation with Qatar in order to find an alternative truce to the Egyptian one. However, as Israel still refuses to negotiate with Hamas, and as the Palestinians are still divided, the situation, as Foreign Minister Lieberman put it, may enter the limbo stage without any solution to the current crisis.
And also joins us right now in the studio is Professor Uzi Rabi, the director of the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the Tel Aviv University. Good evening.
Good evening.
So we just spoke about if Israel won this battle or this operation after this announcement from the Islamic Jihad. Can we say that Hamas, the Islamic Jihad, won this operation?
Well, winning, losing is sort of a relative term, so I won't delve into that. I know that what the Hamas actually has in mind is to get back with the goods, and the goods are the money for the salaries. It's the Rafah crossing. It's maybe some other modification when it comes to the siege. And this is something that remains to be seen how cards are going to be played in the negotiating table. So basically Hamas is, dealing with what we call ceasefire, would like to have a ceasefire, and I think we're going to have that. But I think that the difficult part of the game is still lies ahead, and we'll have to just look at that in a different way.
You're talking about the playing cards. Let's look at a little bit about the playing cards. Let's talk a little bit about Egypt and Syria and Iran and Qatar and Saudi Arabia, which do have, let's say, a significant role this time in this operation, because they have also strategic targets that they want to reach also.
Well, this is exactly what I beg our policymakers in Israel to understand. What we have is a wonderful, fascinating, what I would call geopolitical new chessboard. And if Israel will know how to play the cards once again, actually there are kind of a bunch of states, there is a bunch of states, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, Egypt, Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, and Israel, which have what I would call a wide common denominator, which is based on two things: anti-Muslim Brothers and anti-Iran.
Although Jordan is the base of the Muslim Brotherhoods?
Sorry?
Although Jordan is a kind of a base for the Muslim Brotherhood?
The kingdom is the, the Muslim Brotherhood is an anathema to the whole notion of what we call Hashemite kingdom in Jordan. So basically there are some chances actually to be used, or opportunities, if Israel would actually play it right. But on the other hand, we had Qatar and Turkey, and we had those assessments coming from Rouhani in Iran. They would like actually to rebuild or renew what we call the Muqawama axis, and we'll have to wait and see, because this is a different play. But let me just remind you one more thing, which is pretty important here. We heard what happened nowadays, today in Lebanon. We know what's going on in Syria and Iraq. Basically, the huge sectarian war in the region, Sunni-Shi'i war, is the prominent conflict in this region. And I think that there is kind of a secondary circle, which is the Gaza-Israel thing. And actually, it has kind of an impact on the geopolitical chessboard.
If we're talking about the political arena, of course, in the political international arena, it seems that Israel has a strategic, right now, period of time to reach and to use the Palestinian card to its benefit.
Well, yes, but it's a double-edged sword, because there are variables that work in Israel's favor, as Professor Abi just described, and I agree with that. But the structure of the government and the structure of negotiations with the Palestinians, with the Palestinian Authority, hasn't changed and did not change and will not change as a result of this war. So the day after, we're faced with a right-wing coalition with Abu Mazen, who does not control, right-wing coalition in Israel, with Mahmoud Abbas, who controls the West Bank but not Gaza. And in fact, Mr. Netanyahu's takeaway from this is not going to be to negotiate with Mahmoud Abbas. It's going to be...
He won't negotiate with Mahmoud Abbas, although he's being criticized for not making him any stronger in this?
That's correct. That is my prediction.
Yes.
And he will not do that, because his takeaway will be that, look at Gaza, look what happened when Israel ceded territory. Hamas is also strong in the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority controlled Gaza, but then Hamas took over. Yes, there were elections, but they were rigged, he will say, and nor will he blame George W. Bush for insisting on Hamas's participation, but that's long history. He will say the same thing about the West Bank. He will say, look what happened to Ben Gurion International Airport when one rocket apparently hit a town not far from the airport. 17 or 27 airlines stopped flying to Israel immediately. It was shut for two and a half days.
So how is he explaining the coordination with the Palestinian Authority? How is he explaining the, let's say, the silence, the quiet that comes from the West Bank in this current operation?
It has to do with the coalition that Professor Rabi described, that Israel finds itself in this coalition that is anti-Muslim Brotherhood, anti-Hamas, anti-Daesh or ISIS, I don't know about the Iran issue. That's a broader issue. We may disagree on this, but that's not significant here and now. I don't think anything is going to happen with this government under these circumstances in the immediate aftermath of this operation, whether it's today or in 2 months.
Colonel Camp, if we're watching what is happening strategically, is it in the benefit of Israel, let's say, to maybe leave the control to the military control to Mahmoud Abbas and maybe reoccupy the Gaza Strip and start rebuilding it?
I'm sorry, I don't understand that quite. Leave the military control of Gaza to Abbas?
No, to leave the military control to Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank, basically just getting out of the West Bank, and leave the control to Israel and the Gaza Strip until it's rebuilt.
No, I don't think there's any way that Israel should be leaving control of any aspect of security in the West Bank to anyone apart from Israel, because we can see, I mean, there are many lessons. We've already heard about what happened to Ben Gurion Airport as a result of a single missile being flown in that direction. Obviously, the potential for something like that from the West Bank, if Israel's not in control of it, is much, much greater. That's even without the advance of the Islamic State towards the Jordanian border. Who knows what that's going to do? I think the idea of leaving the West Bank, and certainly the idea of a plan, for example, to put an international force there, the Allen plan, is to me is unworkable. There's no possibility of relying on the international community in relation to the West Bank. I think the possibility of relying on an international force of some sort to assist with security in Gaza is a bit different. It's a different question. I would still be dubious about it. Certainly, I don't think Israel could depend entirely on it. But then, what can it depend upon in the current situation?
How much of a big threat can we say that ISIS is right now to Israel?
Not a big threat in the meantime, but I think that what we have there when it comes to Iraq, Syria, and parts of Lebanon, it's becoming the real threat to the incumbents. I mean, it's Bashar or Hezbollah in Beirut and even Maliki in Iraq.
They took over a big dam.
Yeah, and this is exactly actually what I mean, because it seems that this Daesh thing is much more resilient than just Al-Qaeda squad or group or whatever, and I think it's part of this, I would say, new Middle East, new geopolitical chessboard, because all these states, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, again, artificial states created by the Sykes-Picot Agreement, becoming failed states, and those slices were taken captive by the ISIS activists. I think, though, that when it comes to Israel, actually what Israel should carefully listen to, the voices coming from Golan Heights, because some parts of that are being taken by Daesh, by ISIS. And of course, when it comes to our borders in the north, Hezbollah would have loved actually coming up with kind of a U-turn and using his rockets against Israel at this time. The simple fact he doesn't do that is that he is entangled in kind of a very bloody and I would say deep hostility that he has with ISIS. And basically, this is the battle in Lebanon. Hezbollah is being hunted in Beirut by those Muslim radicals. So
he's not planning any surprises to Israel anytime soon, like the surprises Israel faced in the Gaza Strip?
Daesh?
No, Hezbollah.
Hezbollah, no. I think that, I mean, this was exactly kind of a golden opportunity for Hezbollah, actually, to use his new tactics, to use his missiles, to use, or even, actually, kind of a lip service, to do something in order to say that you are part and parcel of what we call the Muqawama axis. The opposite is true. And this is something by which to say that Hezbollah is in kind of a real struggle of politics of survival, and basically he is threatened from within. Part of his warriors or activists are in Syria. There are some rumors that there are many complaints within the ranks of Hezbollah about his or him being sent to Syria. But in the meantime, as I said before, Beirut is in the eye of the storm. And basically, this is kind of what I said, actually, new geopolitical map. And I would actually love bringing our map. I mean, we had that in the MDC, the center where I am the director, Moshe Dayan Center in Tel Aviv University. What we had lastly, is in our last annual conference, is what we call actually the alternative map of the Middle East, and this is the crux. This is what counts.
Everyone has an alternative of the Middle East, an alternative map of the Middle East. That's the problem.
Yeah, but actually, how are you going to play the alternative map? Who are going actually to be your partners? What you are going to do with those ad hoc alliance, and basically the camp that we just mentioned here. This is part and parcel of the new map, and I think that it is high time for Israel also to just reread the map of the Middle East.
If Israel needs to reread it, maybe the United States needs to reread it in order to really understand it.
I knew that was coming at some point. Let me just add one thing to Uzi. The funny thing about Hezbollah here, I think you were talking about two different things. When you said surprises, you meant tunnels.
And he was
talking about the action. He was talking about a decision to act. But maybe there are tunnels, by the way. Maybe there are many tunnels. But the funny thing about Hezbollah, just as a side note, there is a traditional there was a traditional school of analysis on Middle East politics and on Arab politics and on Lebanese politics in particular that always pit status quo forces and anti-status quo forces. It's one of your predecessors at that center, Itamar Rabinovich, who came up with this. Anyway, Hezbollah, oddly enough, paradoxically, has become a status quo force, which is why ISIS is too weird and too radical for Hezbollah. Hezbollah all of a sudden a conservative party, not a revolutionary. Okay. Your question about the U.S. was?
Maybe they need to reread.
Why should they? Seriously.
The new map of the Middle East.
I'm not sure they do. And I'm not sure they're wrong in their current reading, and I know how people love to blame America for everything.
No, we don't love to play America. It just seems that America really don't understand what is actually going on here.
History proves that neither Jews nor Arabs understand either. So the
idea
that for all our shortcomings, it's actually John Kerry's fault, Hillary Clinton's fault, Warren Christopher's fault, Henry Kissinger's fault. Go back to Thomas Jefferson.
After you're blaming one another, you need to start blaming the third part.
Exactly, Lucy. That's the one thing that Israelis and Palestinians have always managed to agree on, and that it's America's fault. Now, why am I, and I'm not being cynical here, why do I think that they don't need to read it again? America is in a gradual but steady process of disengagement from the Middle East. It has to do with a variety of reasons, energy independence, complete disillusionment with Arab politics and the need for Arab coalitions. When America looks at the geopolitical map in the Middle East, it sees three very powerful countries, Israel, Turkey, and Iran. Each projects its power differently, and each has different influence. None of them is Arab. America looks at the traditional Arab world and it no longer exists. It's part of the map that Uzi was talking about. And so the combination of those things, plus a need to shift, or what they call pivot, away toward East Asia, and crises that just come out of nowhere, like the Ukraine, like the Crimean Peninsula, and now the Malaysian jet, et cetera, shifts America's attention away from the Middle East. For them, it's a big headache to deal with with Gaza. They just don't care. So when we accuse them of not reading it correctly, they say, you know what? We've tried reading this for 25 years. Apparently, this is a lousy book. We're done reading this.
So just
don't blame me.
I'm not blaming you. No, I'm not blaming you, definitely. I just want to go and see what is happening in the Gaza border, where our I-24 News correspondent, Shahal Peled, is standing by. Shahal?
Yes, Lucy, here on the Gaza border, we continue to hear continuous shelling and bombardments of Israeli artillery and airstrikes over inside the Gaza Strip. And so it seems the 20th day of Operation Protective Edge is very similar to the ones before it. dozens, over 60 rockets fired today at the towns and villages and cities of southern Israel, much like every other day, unfortunately, and despite the unilateral humanitarian ceasefire that took place today from the Israeli side between 8 and 5 local time. Still, there were ongoing rockets fired from the Gaza Strip, and according to Palestinian sources, the Air Force has also continued to strike inside the Gaza Strip. They're talking about 30 injured inside the Shati refugee camp in the western part of the Gaza Strip. An 8-year-old girl killed in this strike, and this, of course, follows 10 killed yesterday from a United Nations inside a United Nations school, possibly by another airstrike from the Israeli forces. Today we know of 2 Israeli soldiers lightly wounded in the area after a rocket exploded near them, and so it definitely seems the ongoing fightings are very far from ending. We also heard today about a possibility of a threat, a security threat in the area. Once again, heavy forces were called to the area to search and close and secure the area of the villages bordering Gaza. Eventually, this threat was cancelled, but it once again is an example of how much the entire area is on alert, is on an edge. The hundreds of residents that have fled their homes from the southern part here to the north, to temporary housings in the north, say they are very much afraid to come back to their homes because of this possible infiltration of terrorists to their villages with attempts of abduction or killing residents and soldiers.
Yes, thank you very much, Shahal Pellet, for this. We've been mentioning ISIS and Colonel Camp, and we're seeing that demolishing Hamas is not actually possible on the ground for now. Can you, maybe the shift needs to be if Hamas is, if ISIS is too, let's say, on the edge and too radical for Hezbollah and for Hamas also. Maybe the shifts need to be also on ISIS. Can you demolish ISIS? Can you actually, and how can you do it militarily?
Well, I could do it, of course, without a problem. But no, I would not say that. Personally, I would not say that ISIS is particularly any more radical than Hamas or Hezbollah. I think they are. They have a much freer hand. They have no concerns about anything, and therefore they can exercise free range. As their sort of Al Qaeda brothers have done wherever they've kind of cropped up. We saw their bestiality in Iraq over many years.
They're the younger but more sophisticated brother of Al Qaeda.
Yeah, sort of. They've just got freer range. They're allowed to operate without too much inhibition. And Al Qaeda was severely constrained and to a large extent defeated in Iraq by a combination of the US surge there, US forces, US intelligence airstrikes, and by the what was called the Awakening Councils, which were the Sunni tribes bought by America, armed by America, and equipped by America to assist America to destroy large elements of Al Qaeda. Now that was possible when US forces were there with all their might. Since they withdrew from Iraq, the Iraqi forces have proved to be far from up to that task, and I don't see how they're going to be able to achieve that task right now. Possibly in the future, possibly with assistance from outside, but certainly not with their own resources as things stand at present.
Yes, Colonel Camp, thank you very much, because I know that you have to go right now. So thank you very much for being with me, and you two are staying. You're not going anywhere. But we want to go and take a look at an Israeli attack on a UN school in Gaza, which killed 10 people yesterday, drew exceptionally harsh condemnation from all around the world. I-24 News correspondent Daniel Campus reports.
On Sunday morning, an IDF strike outside an UNRWA school killed at least 10 people and wounded dozens more. Immediately afterwards, exceptionally harsh worldwide condemnation began to be expressed.
Indeed, in the hours of this morning, the IDF targeted a group of terrorists on a motorcycle, at least 2 people that were adjacent to the school in high speed. We struck them, and we are currently looking into the consequences of this strike.
After receiving the news, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon appealed for the sides to put an end to the madness in Gaza, describing the strike on the school as a moral outrage and a criminal act. UNRWA spokesman Chris Gunness immediately demanded an investigation into the events.
We vigorously condemned this attack because we had notified the Israeli army 33 times about the fact that there were people at this shelter, this school, and the last time was an hour before. In the end, what happened is that at least 9 people were killed and 27 injured. We want a report, we want an investigation, and we want one urgently. We need to find out who is responsible because it alarms us that these attacks continue.
UN States Department spokesperson Jen Psaki also slammed the strike, saying the U.S. was appalled by the disgraceful shelling outside the UNRWA school. She reaffirmed that the presence of combatants in the area did not justify the targeting near the school and called on Israel to do more to avoid civilian casualties. According to UNRWA officials, they are currently sheltering some 250,000 Gazan civilians escaping the violence. Israel has been accused of indirectly shelling some UN facilities during the almost month-long conflict in Gaza. But UNRWA officials have also acknowledged that rockets have been discovered stored in at least 3 of their buildings.
Let's look at this from the international arena that Benjamin... Oh, by the way, Richard Kemp decided that he's going to stay with us, so...
Accordingly, I stayed. We didn't want to leave you.
Yes, everyone is staying here for now. We want to look at it from the international arena. Right now, it's another, let's say, phase that Benjamin Netanyahu needs to deal with, that Israel needs to deal with, and to explain to the world these horrific images that are coming out from the Gaza Strip. How do you start rebuilding that Israel, let's say the PR of Israel outside?
Well,
because you cannot win with these kind of images.
But it's important that you just said that, because most people in Jerusalem think it's winnable. And they don't understand that there are certain things that you may need to do. You got to do what you got to do, as the Americans say, but you're not going to win both the war and the PR war. You just cannot. On the same token, imagine 24/7 television, social networks in 1945 Dresden. What would the world have said about the British and American air forces? That they're committing genocide, that they're killing innocent German children, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Some things you cannot and should not defend. You should say you're sorry. When a father picks up a 7-year-old dead daughter from a rubble in Sajiyah, there's no way in the world that you can blame Hamas for this, that you can blame the Peel Commission in 1937, that you can blame Ban Ki-moon and the UN. You did this. You did this by mistake. And you have to say you're not going to win. Now, let's take this to a higher level. There's a critical mass of pictures coming out of Gaza that make winning impossible. We've reached that critical mass. What President Obama did last week was a huge favor for Israel, because he shielded Israel from international pressures by supposedly or seemingly pressuring Israel himself.
Yes.
Okay, so that prevented the UN Security Council from convening and trying to slam Israel, and would have forced Obama into casting a veto that he may not want to cast. This needs to be explained in the context of this entire conversation of ISIS, of Hezbollah, of Al-Qaeda, this is a threat to Arabs, Muslims, Westerners, to everyone. This is shooting across Regent Park. This is shooting across Central Park. This is shooting across Grant Park in Chicago. This is not intercontinental ballistic missiles. This is homemade small rockets, and people need to understand this. Is it winnable? No, it's not winnable. Will there be international pressure in the next few days? Yeah, there's a beginning of a trend. Just today I read that British Prime Minister David Cameron is saying that he's rethinking or revisiting Britain's arms sales to Israel. It's symbolic more than substantive, because of the volume of trade in this category is not that big, but nonetheless Britain is a major friend. You will see this pressure mounting unless something else happens. unless something else, some Malaysian jet is going to fall off the thin blue air, or something. Look, because Syria surely doesn't interest anyone.
It doesn't move anyone.
Thousands of people a week are being butchered in Syria, and no one gives a damn.
No one gives a damn. And if the public international, let's say, the public arena, the international arena is not going to forgive or not going to give Israel a win in the PR, how come the public opinion, the Arabic public opinion, is going to give them any chance?
Well, I see kind of a difference between the international public opinion and the Arab public opinion. And again, if just to get back a follow-up on what Alon said before, the United States is being taken by many in the Middle East as a giant in retreat. And this is part and parcel of this new geopolitical map, because there is a change of the guard. And this is why I think that everybody looks at things in a different way. But when it comes, again, to Hamas and Hezbollah, and by the way, the grave mistake America is doing here, and Obama just has a wrong concept. Because what he thinks is that Hezbollah, or maybe Hamas, maybe Erdogan in Turkey, are kind of a good combination of authenticity and democracy. Which means actually those people were elected by, those men were elected by the people. They do come up with what they call actually their authenticity, Islamic values and stuff. And in the long run, I think that the Obama administration thought that this is the right recipe for the Middle East. Not Daesh, of course, not Al-Qaeda. This is kind of a middle course. And this is much better than the dictators. And this is why they said from the beginning, Mubarak should go. And thereafter actually became kind of a bunch of inconsistencies. And I think that America, in the end of the day, doesn't have kind of a coherent strategy whatsoever regarding the Middle East. But in the Middle East, Daesh is kind of a real threat for many Arab states. They are anxious about Daesh. Others are anxious about Iran. This is not something that was invented in the recent year. It comes from times immemorial. It's Arab-Persian dichotomy, Sunni-Shia dichotomy, and this is why I said, if we do understand the bunch of primordial identities coming to the fore at the expense of nation states, if we have to be aware of the voices of history, because if we do internalize actually the new game, we're gonna actually take advantage of that. And we have to make sure that we know what's going on.
And we just say that Al Arabiya broadcast is reporting on a ceasefire at 9 p.m. tonight. Like we started at Israeli time, of course, which means in 20 minutes. Maybe a Colonel Camp, Britain and France and the Western countries, the European countries, are forgetting the fact that this threat is coming to knock on their doors. And it's going to knock on their doors when people are leaving the United Kingdom, leaving France, and going to fight in Syria, and going to fight in all these places in Iraq, and coming back and bringing this threat back to Europe.
I think one point I'd like to make before I address that is that we talk about the very large number of casualties in the West, in Gaza, and the very large number of civilian casualties, huge, overwhelming proportion of civilian casualties, 70 to 80%, I think the UN have said. But those figures are based on the information coming from Hamas itself, not from any independent source. I think we should be very cautious about the number of innocent civilians that Israel has killed during the course of this operation, including this. I mean, there are certainly there is huge doubt about the reality of what happened in that school yesterday, that whether or not 10 people did get killed in that school yesterday. I think that's hugely in doubt. But of course, the pictures are there, the statements are there, the condemnation from the UN Secretary General is there. So what happened in reality is almost irrelevant. But I don't think we just pass over the fact that those figures, the figures given out by effectively by Hamas, we should not consider them to be as they are. Of course, in Cast Lead, we saw a huge exaggeration in the number of civilian casualties killed by Israel on the basis of Hamas's figures then. There's no reason why we should rely on it now. But Britain, I think, going to the point you raised, Britain, one of the reasons why Britain is reviewing, in inverted commas, its arms sales to Israel, one of the reasons why Britain and other European countries abstained in a UN Human Rights Council resolution condemning Israel for war crimes and instigating a further investigation. One of the reasons is because Britain is terrified of jihadists coming back from Syria and Iraq. It's the major security concern in the United Kingdom today, is those returning jihadists. And there always in the back of the Prime Minister's mind and the mind of other politicians in the UK is the Muslim constituency he has in the UK, the extremists among them, the possibility and the likelihood probably of terrorist attacks being carried out in the UK. And I think there is a, maybe even subconsciously, there is an element of appeasement in his words and actions in relation to this conflict. But of course, the question I always ask when people like David Cameron say that Israel should do more to reduce civilian casualties, well, what is it that they should do? How else should Israel fight this war? There may be plenty of other ways to fight it, but no one that I've heard of has suggested a viable alternative.
We've been talking about that, of course, everybody's talking about war crimes and condemnations all over on what Israel is doing in the Gaza Strip and about the casualties in the Gaza Strip. Why do the Palestinians are not going to the UN and demanding an investigation? Because they want to, but why is it? Because they're saying that they might, they're stopping it for now because Hamas is afraid that they will be charged also with war crimes.
Yeah, and I think that they are focused now on what's going on in the ceasefire. It's articles, actually what they can get, but thereafter, actually, they have declared that they are going actually to just use that. And by the way, it would be part and parcel of the diplomatic war, which is going to be waged by Palestinians against Israel thereafter. It would be just part of
But going and blaming Israel for war crimes, wouldn't it, and especially in this operation, wouldn't it stop the...
Yeah, it could harm the what I call unity government, which is still there. And we'll have to see actually how they're going to play it. But basically, Abu Mazen would like to come to the UN corridors representing Palestine and heading this unity government, even if it is an artificial government. And I think that in due time, they will use actually those cards in kind of a later on way.
In one way or another, is he already doing it behind the scenes? Mahmoud Abbas? Yes.
I'm not an expert on Mahmoud Abbas, and even though I was on various negotiating teams with the Palestinians, but I really am not. I have to admit, maybe Uzi, maybe Colonel Kemp will disagree. I think that Abu Mazen, or Mahmoud Abbas, from the outset, intended to pursue the international path, the state by virtue of internationalization, rather than the bilateral negotiations. I think he was going to go to the UN at some point after negotiations fail. I think this provides him with further legitimacy rather than less, which is why it is less than strategically successful for Israel. He's going to say, look what they did in Gaza. Look at the devastation. We're stateless. The Hamas is a result of our statelessness. It is not a cause of our statelessness. And I could see a world that is extraordinarily sympathetic and forthcoming. He knows that it's pointless, or it's an exercise in futility to negotiate with Mr. Netanyahu. Mr. Netanyahu thinks the same about the Palestinian Authority for reasons we discussed it earlier. And thus, Abbas will try and do three things. He will do, as Uzi said, he will appeal to the various tribunals, war crime tribunals, the UN, etc. And he will seek statehood or further legitimacy or upgrading the status of the Palestinians in the UN through the UN rather than through negotiations. If I were Netanyahu, I would encourage him to do so and say out publicly that I would be the first one to recognize a state of Palestine. But that's further down the road.
Gentlemen, thank you very, very much for being. Do you want to stay? If you're feeling very comfortable in this chair, so please, it will be my pleasure that the three of you will stay here as long as you want. Thank you very much for being with me and accompanying me in this part. And we're moving right now live to East Jerusalem, where today it was just another front that Israel faced, and maybe just a reminder of the second Intifada, maybe a reminder about what might happen inside Israel if this situation will continue to deteriorate. And right now, standing there is Shai Ben-Ari. Shai.
Yes, Lucy, I would say that what you mentioned is on everybody's mind here in Jerusalem, but we're talking about a very tense situation, probably the most tense day in this city for a number of years, and we've been covering this situation, of course. Basically, we're talking about two terror attacks that were already mentioned, one around noontime, where basically a tractor driven by a Palestinian managed to overturn a bus. A man was run over and killed, 6 others were injured. Later on, a Palestinian opened fire on an Israeli soldier and severely injured him, a 20-year-old soldier, then managed to get away. Basically, the search for him is still going on. And we've just come actually from the neighborhood of Jabal Mukaber, not far from here in East Jerusalem, where the situation was very tense indeed. That is where the Palestinian who was involved in that first incident is from. He was, of course, killed by policemen on the scene. We spoke with his uncle, who basically saw the events very differently. The family of that Palestinian basically claimed, we're talking about Mohammed Jabis, basically claimed that this incident began when a number of Israeli youths began throwing stones at that same Palestinian who was driving the tractor, and this later caused him to panic and led to the events that happened later on. I don't know if we can confirm that version of the events. Certainly the version being presented by the Israeli authorities is very different. But I'll also add that basically while we were in Jabal Mukaber, a very large security force, police, riot force, arrived on the scene basically to conduct a very extensive search of the house of that same Palestinian. There were fears among the locals that we were actually talking about some sort of demolition, which has been the case in the past. That did not happen this evening. Basically, the situation diffused itself and ended calmly. Calmer heads prevailed, let's say, and we actually witnessed a conversation between one of the local community leaders and the police chief who came with the forces. And I could say that basically there was a very calm conversation that diffused the situation, and basically the situation there ended non-violently.
Yes, Shai Ben-Ari, thank you very much for this. And just to continue what what Shai just said, in the middle of tense days, 2 terror attacks in Jerusalem. An Israeli soldier was shot in the stomach on Mount Scopus, and police shot and killed a Palestinian driver who flipped a bus on its side with a construction vehicle. A 25-year-old Palestinian was killed in this incident, and 5 others were slightly injured. And this well-known terror method is terrifying yet again Jerusalem's residents. I-24 News correspondent Eli Ochenberg with the details.
The predicated fear of the Israeli security forces became real Monday in Jerusalem as 2 terror attacks were committed in the middle of the city. Around 4 p.m. local time, a 20-year-old Israeli soldier was shot on Mount Scopus by an unknown assailant who fled from the scene on a motorbike. A few hours earlier, Israeli police shot dead a Palestinian man who rammed the tractor he was driving into a bus. A pedestrian who was nearby when the bus flipped on its side was taken to the hospital in critical condition, but succumbed to his wounds before he could get there. The bus itself was empty at the time of the attack.
We are currently investigating the incident, and I promise that we will have further conclusion in the end of the investigation.
Public Security Minister Yitzhak Aharonovich arrived at the scene of the incident and said police fear that such a terror attack would be attempted. He also praised the alertness of the police.
They shot him, stopped him, and their quick response to the incident is exactly what I expect from the Israeli policemen.
These kind of terror attacks are a known method, especially in Jerusalem. In October 2013, a Palestinian riding a heavy vehicle rammed into an army base north of the capital, lightly injuring a soldier. In March 2009, a similar event occurred when a tractor driver slammed into a police vehicle in the city, wounding 2 policemen and causing major damage to vehicles and buses. In July 2008, 3 people were killed and 36 wounded in the center of the city when another Palestinian tractor driver plowed into many pedestrians, flipping 2 buses and vehicles. The Israeli security establishment feared all throughout recent weeks that other problematic spots in the country will become even more tense. And even though many thought Operation Protective Edge is coming to an end, today's event remind them all that the war is still on.
Yes, welcome back. Gershom Baskin is the co-chairman of the IPCRI, Israeli-Palestinian Creative Solution. He's a peace activist who has close ties with Hamas and who played a role in the release of Gilad Shalit in 2011. Mr. Baskin, thank you very much for coming.
My pleasure.
You know, it seems lately that we get the impression that maybe Hamas is understanding Israel better than Israel understanding Hamas, especially in the last few days, and especially in this current operation.
It's difficult to speak about how much Hamas understands Israel. I think that they have discovered weak points in Israel. They understand the weak parts of Israeli society, which we, of course, present as the strength of Israeli society, the solidarity of Israeli society, the kind of care that we take when a soldier is abducted or suspected of being abducted. And they know that this is, for us, as we presented our strong point, they detect it as a weak point. I think with regard to our understanding of Hamas, we got it completely wrong. I hear on television all the analysts, mostly former military people, who are talking about the Israeli victories over Hamas. Hamas do not look at the picture in the same way. For them, they are winning this war. They're directing the war. They're dragging Israel into Gaza. They will present themselves as the victors of the war, and they will say, look how many soldiers we killed. We had 3 million Israelis living under the terror of our rocket fire. We hit Tel Aviv. We hit Jerusalem. We closed down the civil aviation to Israel for 36 hours. This is a strategic threat. We emerged from our tunnels and our bunkers intact. Most of our fighters are alive. Our political leaders are all alive. They destroyed our homes. They destroyed our towns and our cities. They killed our women and our children, and we are still here, and we are stronger than ever. This is the way they're going to present themselves.
So how come Israel doesn't understand this? How come Israel is still going with the same message to the world and is getting the support? If we want to look at it, it is an unprecedented support that Israel got in this operation. Right. But how come Israel is still saying, using human shields, they are not protecting their civilians, they are using missiles against their civilians, but when the other side just doesn't care. They don't care. They don't care.
No, I don't think it's that they don't care. I've heard Israelis say they're happy when their women and children get killed. I don't know any Palestinian who's happy when their women and children get killed. There's a lot of solidarity amongst the Palestinians, and today Palestinians will tell you there's no Fatah and Hamas. This war doesn't exist anymore. We're all Palestinians. We're under attack. I think that Israel often doesn't get it because we interpret reality through the prism of the military lens mostly. And from a military perspective, we've destroyed them. We've wiped out most of their rocket power. We destroyed their tunnels. We've destroyed their infrastructure. When you look at it through the prism of the military lens, we have done an enormous amount of damage to Gaza. And we expect, we hope, that after the war is over, people will come out from the bunkers and come out and go back to their homes that aren't there anymore and say, Hamas did this to us.
How do you explain this to the world?
It might happen.
How do you explain this to Israel, that they're saying, okay, they can go back to their homes? To which homes? All Beit Lahia is destroyed. Sujaiya is destroyed.
I have very good friends who are very good friends of Israel, who worked with Israel for years. A very good friend in Beit Hanun, who went back to his home, and his home wasn't there anymore. And this is a person who knows so many Israelis and speaks Hebrew, not because he was in prison. He was never in prison. He knows Hebrew because he worked with Israelis for so many years.
Before the first Intifada.
Until the second Intifada. He worked very closely with Israelis. There's nothing that we can do to explain this to them. What we need to do is initiate a political initiative today, which is going to capitalize on the support that Israel has gotten in the region. Forget about the world for a moment. In our region, in our neighbors, Egypt, Jordan, the Saudis, the PLO. Finally, people are beginning to wake up and understand that perhaps Mahmoud Abbas is a real partner. And what we need to do in order to fight Hamas, we need to get rid of Hamas. We need to. Hamas is dedicated to our destruction. If we end this war with an agreement that empowers Hamas, that enables Hamas to claim victory, we are endangering the entire region. We're endangering the stability of the West Bank. We're endangering the stability of Israeli Arabs. We're endangering the stability of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. This is really bad for Israel. That's why we need a political initiative today which is going to reach out to the Arab League and say, help us to deal with Islamic terrorism, because they have the same problems, but that's going to cost. And the price that it's going to cost is Israel accepting the Arab Peace Initiative as the basis for negotiations with the Palestinians.
What are the targets of Hamas?
Hamas has a long-term strategy. Hamas is in no rush. So for Hamas, it doesn't matter if they make an agreement with Israel via a third party for a 10-year hutna, what they call a 10-year quiet period. We had a 2-year quiet period after a pillar of defense, and they used it to rebuild themselves, to get more rockets and to build the tunnels. So Hamas says, give us 10 years now, and we'll live.
And
we
we'll
won't attack
show you in 10 years.
Yeah, we'll show you in 10 years. This is their long-term strategy. This is why a movement like Hamas needs to be gotten rid of. And the way to get rid of a movement like Hamas is by understanding that when you create a reality in which 1.8 million people are living, the majority, the overwhelming majority of them, young people, have no future, have no hopes, have no dreams. What can a young person in Gaza dream for? So what they're told is that death is much better than life. In death, heaven, in Islamic terms, is all the things that are prohibited in this world are permitted in the next world. Heaven is heaven. So if life is so terrible and death is a better option, you end up with a movement like Hamas. We have to understand that. The reality in Gaza has to change, and it has to be a change that Israel initiates, because if it's a prize of the war to Hamas, we lose.
How many times Israel missed a chance?
Countless times. But both sides have missed opportunities. It's not just Israel. But the thing is that I care more about Israel than I care about the other side. And of course, Israel is a strong country with a strong economy and a strong democracy. And we have the opportunity. The story of Zionism is all about us taking our fate in our own hands and shaping the reality as we see it. And here we have a situation where Israel is sitting and waiting. We're waiting for the Egyptians. We're waiting for the Americans. We're waiting for, I don't know who we're waiting for. This is the startup nation that every morning has a new patent that we put out in the world. We take the initiative militarily. We take the initiative economically. Israel's a great place, an amazing country with so much energy. Where's our political initiative? Why are we sitting around waiting for someone else to tell us how this war should end? Why aren't we determining our own future?
It's not, it's these are the questions that everyone is asking.
No, unfortunately, they're not. They're not asking the questions.
At least when we are trying to understand and why Israel is not taking any decision, and what is Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu afraid from? What is he afraid from?
I'm not sure that it's fear. I think that he is a difficult decision maker. I think it's hard for him to make decisions. But my fear, my greatest fear, is that what he wants is to leave a weakened Hamas in place.
How much is Egypt? What are exactly the interests of Egypt in this scenario?
For Egypt, Hamas is the Muslim Brotherhood. We saw what Egypt did to the Muslim Brotherhood. It crushed them. It destroyed them. It arrested all of their leaders. It put their spiritual leader and the heads of the Muslim Brotherhood movement on death sentences in Egypt. It closed down more than 1,000 tunnels that were smuggling between Sinai and Gaza. And by the way, they closed those 1,000 tunnels without killing a single Palestinian. Isn't that amazing?
It's amazing what you're saying, because it's so obvious, but it's not. It's not to almost all the leadership. Because what? Because they don't understand that you can sit down and talk with Hamas? Or
no, we shouldn't talk with Hamas. The Egyptians invited a Palestinian delegation, which is now in Cairo, and there are members of Hamas in the delegation, but the Egyptians don't let them in the room. The Egyptians don't talk to Hamas. When the Egyptians came out with their unilateral ceasefire, they didn't ask Hamas. They declared.
When you sat down with them, what?
No, when I sat down with them, I talked about Gilad Shalit, and I talked about a specific ceasefire at a specific time. On political issues, we have a political partner, and that's the PLO. Our political partner is not Hamas. We should not talk to Hamas. We should isolate Hamas. We should do what the Egyptians are doing to Hamas. They isolate them politically, and they isolate them militarily, and they isolate them economically. And Hamas was at its weakest point ever 2 months ago.
And yet, it seems that, Mahmoud Abbas, we always talk that something is happening in the West Bank lately, and this quiet in the West Bank, it's a little bit frightening in one way or another.
No, it's actually not. You know what's happening in the West Bank is that the Palestinian Authority is using its forces to crush any dissent there, and they're using violence against their own people to crush dissent. So how come
Israel's always going against Mahmoud Abbas? How come Israel
That's a question you have to ask the Prime Minister. This is another one of those lost opportunities, and hopefully at the end of this war, we will understand. If I were Prime Minister, you know what I would do? Tomorrow, I would initiate. Tonight, I would call up Abdel Fattah Sisi, the president of Egypt, and King Abdullah of Jordan, and Mahmoud Abbas, and I would say, let's meet. If you don't want to come to Jerusalem, fine. We'll go to Sharm el-Sheikh. We'll go to Amman. We'll go to wherever you want. Let's sit down, the four of us together, the immediate neighbors, and let's figure out how we're going to deal with Gaza, how we're going to stabilize Gaza, how we're going to disarm Hamas together. What does Israel have to do to work together with its neighbors to create a situation which will create stability and security and change the face of this region? We have this opportunity today, not alone. It's not bilateral. It's not Israeli-Palestinian. I understand that might be difficult for Netanyahu, but now we have a possibility of expanding it and coming up with regional security arrangements. There's a political price, as I said. Israel cannot continue to occupy the Palestinian people. Israel will have to recognize the existence of a Palestinian state, which will include the West Bank and Gaza. And as the Palestinian president of the Palestinian state, Abbas and the PLO can retake control of Gaza. Not as the Palestinian Authority, the watchdog of Israel. That can't happen.
Who should take care of the rebuilding of the
international community with mostly Arab money. This should be done, and it should be done through an international body which has supervisory abilities. Israel should be involved in it for sure. Israel should definitely be involved. We have an interest in having happy neighbors. This is something that we have to understand always. The Israeli spokespeople say all the time now, the people of Gaza are not our enemy. We don't want to kill innocent people in Gaza. We're doing a pretty bad job at sending them that message that the people of Gaza are not our enemies. What we need to do is also sell them afterwards that we want to help to rebuild a peaceful, stable, secure Gaza in their interest, in our interest.
And the $1 million question, I think, is how do you change their minds after this operation?
Well, I think by good intentions and good actions. Actions speak a lot more than nice words. We need to change what we do.
Yes, definitely. Mr. Baskin, thank you for your words and thank you for coming
My pleasure.
Here to the studio. Yes, and during this Operation Protective Edge, the terror tunnels emerged on the biggest security threats to Israel. I-24 News correspondent Amjad Abu Arafi and Mael Ben Uliel got an access to see this underground threat from close.
It is with such a tunnel that Hamas tried several times to infiltrate Israel in the past few weeks. The objective is to carry out a terrorist attack against Israeli soldiers and civilians. This IDF officer is responsible for showing I-24 News how tunnels of terror look like.
This tunnel goal is to take a few terrorists inside Israel, to infiltrate Israel and kill and even kidnap civilians or soldiers by using this tunnel. Unfortunately, I don't have to guess. I know that terror assaults like this occurred a few days ago, several times, using tunnels like this one.
An attack like this one, as shown in Hamas footage. Tunnel 3 kilometers long, whose entry is located in a Palestinian house in Khan Yunis, and whose exit is very close to the locality of Ein Shlosha. Tunnel is approximately 17 meters deep, and in it Hamas has access to electricity and even to a telephone. It's large enough to allow us to walk fully upright. The walls and floors are made of concrete. Concrete, it is important to note, which was made by an Israeli company.
It's concrete that is being given from Israel towards Gaza. We have found bags that are written in Hebrew in the name of the company that produces this cement, this concrete. We found those bags in the tunnel. We know that this is an Israeli concrete used to build the terror tunnels inside Israel, unfortunately.
Obviously, Hamas needs to be organized to build such tunnels, and each tunnel costs some hundreds of thousands of euros to build and maintain. A sum which could have been used for Gazan civilians if Hamas had so chosen.
Well, as you can see here, it was fairly simple for us to get in and out of this tunnel. For Hamas militants, it has been a different story altogether. thanks to intense IDF operations which have nearly been completed. It's now clear that these tunnels represent a major and direct threat to the population in this area and the state of Israel in general. Amjad Abu Arafa, I-24 News, from the tunnel close to Kibbutz Ain Shlusha.
Yes, and right now joining me, Amir Oren, for this segment, and also Mr. Yitzhak Levanon, former ambassador to Egypt. Amir, let's start. Can we say that we're seeing the end?
We're seeing the end.
We're always, the light in the tunnel, the end of the tunnel.
Well, you know that when life begins, you can already predict that sometime in the future it will end, unfortunately. But regarding the operation, we are at the very end of the ground phase, because all of the tunnels which have been discovered have been demolished. The Israeli military doesn't have any other mission in the small strip of land it occupied west of the border. So it is preparing to redeploy once certain precautions along the borders are over. So basically it's over on the ground. From the air, rockets from Gaza and air attacks aimed at the launchers go on, and mortar shells aimed at the forces as well as the civilian settlements. If there is a ceasefire, which the latest reports from Egypt speak of, we may see the very end of the operation overall.
So we will just say that the Palestinians are just right now announcing that Egypt will announce a ceasefire tomorrow at 8 a.m. Israeli time. Mr. Yitzhak Levanon, I've been waiting for you to come back, so you will explain to me.
I think that Egypt did it. She did it a few minutes ago.
So it's the win of Egypt? Can we say that it's in this entire operation, the victory is, Egypt can call it as its victory?
I don't think that we should use, the terminology of victory, defeat, etc. But definitely this is, Egypt had scored points, in this round, let's say, of the military operation. Egypt, a month ago, she presented this plan in 2 stages. And they said, look, to the Palestinians, to Hamas, everybody, take it. They say to us also, take it, and we took it. We say immediately yes. The problem with Hamas is that 1 month later, with close to 2,000 people killed, Hamas is accepting the same proposal coming from Egypt. We know for sure that in the meeting that they had this afternoon between General Tuhami, the head of the security of the intelligence, and the joint delegation of all the factions, by the way, because Egypt is not talking to Hamas, it's talking to a joint delegation. Tuhami say in a very clear way, simple, you have claims, I'm ready to discuss it, not now. First, I would like to see a ceasefire, immediate ceasefire, complete ceasefire. So apparently this Palestinian delegation, including Hamas, has no other choice than to accept what they have refused a month ago, with 2,000 people killed.
How come they're accepting this? They are seeing that
because they are in a dire
situation. But are they seeing that 2,000 people in their eyes, in one way or another, is a card to bargain? Is it what?
I believe that at the end of it, when the sand, dust will settle, I think that the population in Gaza will ask Hamas to be accountable. It's exactly what happened, with Hezbollah after the war in Lebanon, etc. They will say, look, for God's sake, the Israelis, proposed to us, I think it was 8 or 9 ceasefires, unilateral ceasefire. We wanted to breathe a little bit, and you refused to do it. Now, with this ceasefire that Egypt has, because I don't take, seriously what the Hamas and the Islamic Jihad is saying about this ceasefire, but Egypt is serious because, they are in Cairo and are discussing the situation.
And they need
If it will hold, and I think that the only condition that it will hold is, and this is why I believe we didn't start at 10 o'clock this evening and we start only 8 o'clock in the morning, they need to receive Mohammed Deif okay, which is the military wing of Hamas. Otherwise, there will be no ceasefire.
It's not good for your broadcast because you need conflict, but one has to agree with Ambassador Levanon. but also with you, even though you phrased it as a question. Yes, there is a victory picture, and it is President Sisi's. He is the big victor of this operation without paying any price at all. Now, let's hope that you are right and that the population, if it doesn't actually rise against Hamas, at least lodge its complaints. Up to now, the Israeli authorities know of some 1,750 casualties, out of which there are many hundreds of women and children, obviously not Hamas members. There are some 800 to 900 Hamas militants who were killed. There are 400,000 people who are displaced, who left their homes. 1/4 of the population.
And have nowhere to go back to.
Well, yes. Right now they reside with their families or at UNRWA sites. They have nowhere to go because their houses and their whole neighborhoods have been demolished. There is a humanitarian crisis. And for what? Just so Hamas will show that it could resist a few weeks more. While all of this time, the entire debate was on the sequence, not on the terms, but on the sequence of whether a ceasefire first and negotiations later, or the other way around.
Let's explain this entire situation from the beginning. We know that this operation started and the rocket firing started because Hamas didn't receive money. Hamas was isolated. Hamas was in a really bad situation, and one of the main goals was to open the blockade, open the siege on the Gaza Strip. Explain to me and to our viewers, what was the siege?
Well,
because everybody's talking about a siege, but no one really understands what is the siege on the Gaza Strip.
We'll get to the siege in half a minute. But first, the sequence of events. On April 29th, Benjamin Netanyahu decided that he does not go along with the fourth batch of prisoner release under the Secretary Kerry proposal of last year. What happened later was that Hamas prisoners in Israeli jails wrote to Khaled Mashal. Khaled Mashal broadcast something which was interpreted as a green light to kidnap Israelis in order to trade for them and get the release of prisoners. The 3 Israeli youngsters were kidnapped in the West Bank, whether by express orders of the Hamas leadership or because they heard what Mashal responded to this prisoner. Then Israel went on an operation in the West Bank against the Hamas leadership there, and there was an additional event where a Hamas operative wanted to launch rockets against Israel, and he was killed by Israeli fire before he managed to do it. In retaliation for that, Hamas started its rocket attacks on July the 7th. And from there, it escalated, with Israel responding and so on and so forth. And then on the 17th, there was this tunnel attack, after which Israel took into the ground. Now, the siege, which followed the Hamas takeover in 2007, meant that all of the ground passages into Gaza are controlled, not necessarily closed. You know that even today there are many, many trucks bringing in food and other supplies from Israel or from the West Bank through Israel into Gaza through Erez and Kerem Shalom. And there are some movements through Rafah, the Rafah crossing into Egypt, but Hamas does not want to help the population. Even the field hospital that Israel established, Hamas doesn't let the wounded and the sick get there because it doesn't want to recognize it.
No flights in or out from the Gaza
Well,
Strip.
the Dahania airfield, not far from Rafah, was established after Yasser Arafat got to Gaza in 1994. But then when the Palestinians started their violence 6 years later, Israel disallowed it.
And from the fishermen.
Yes, fishermen.
Yeah, this is important because Amir didn't mention the naval blockade. This is the most important.
Exactly. So the naval. What about the naval blockade?
Many people in Gaza make their livelihood by fishing, because obviously it's a coastal strip, and they've been fishermen for many generations. And some of them used to go into a deeper sea. when the militants started acting against Israel, 6 years after the Oslo process started, Israel started patrolling the shore and limited the movements of the fishermen, and they claim that there are no fish there anymore. It has to do with global trends of where the fish lie. So Israel is now ready to let them go several miles deeper into the sea, provided that it is not abused by Hamas smuggling weapons into Gaza.
Okay, understanding this.
There is, by the way, in parentheses, there is also the smuggling of weapons through the sea coming from Iran.
Sure.
This is important.
This, of course, with the ships that were stopped by Israel.
Yes.
And by the way, this may be even more important than earlier, because now Egypt restricts the smuggling through Sudan and Egypt proper and Sinai into Gaza.
Now let's look at the Egyptian initiative. What it concludes and what are the Egyptians are trying to reach from this initiative? And at the end of the day, what are they going to win? Because no one wants the headache of the Palestinian. And this is why the Rafah border is not always open for the Palestinians.
I think that the Egyptian position, and more precisely the El-Sisi position, which I'm not talking about Morsi, I'm talking about Sisi. He has a clear idea who is Hamas. For him, Hamas is an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he is fighting the Brotherhood, in my mind, an existential fight within inland, within Egypt. So Egypt of Sisi doesn't want to see any success on the ground going to Hamas. He would like, that Hamas will be weakened. He would like to see, Hamas not having such a strength which can impact inside or inland Egypt. This is the main purpose. The second part of this, which is the same equation, Egypt is committed, has been, is, and will be committed to the Palestinian cause, including the creation of a Palestinian state side by side to Israel, the two-state solution. Egypt is in favor of that. So anything which will harm the general population, in this particular is Gaza, Egypt is against. This is why she is against Hamas, because he was the one who triggered this tragedy to these people. So when they are coming with this initiative, they say, look, first of all, stop it. I would like to save the lives of the people in Gaza, first of all. Don't be foolish to Hamas, because you are shooting and you know that Israel will respond. And nobody, because there is no country in the world that you will fire rocket against a civil population and it will stand, idle by. No, it doesn't exist. So Egypt say to Hamas, stop it, and we will discuss the other things in a second stage. This Egypt didn't change. This is why when Hamas will accept it, and we have to wait and see until 8 o'clock in the morning, because personally we had 8 experience or 9 bad experiences with Hamas. If it will hold, suppose that it will hold, Egypt definitely has a big success in bringing Hamas and all the factions, the Islamic Jihad, the Palestinian Authority, Abu Mazen, everybody, into the same track, which is stop the fighting to save the lives of the Palestinians in Gaza. The second stage will be to reconstruct Gaza. In this stage, I have my own, idea. I think that Israel can, or will, let's say, ease the siege, the naval siege, or the blockade, open the passages, reconstruct Gaza. I think that we have no problem with that. In front of that, there is one condition: that the military wing of the Hamas should be disarmed completely from offensive, deadly, strategic weapons.
And the question is, if it will happen, before you will answer, Amir, we just talked about all the passings and the checkpoints and all the borders. The Kerem Shalom crossing is the route for goods coming into the Gaza Strip, even in times of war. Israelis and Palestinians from Gaza work closely together to make sure the flow of goods does not dry up. I-24 News correspondent Charles Bublizer was there.
Truck after truck carrying humanitarian goods enters war-stricken Gaza. With over 1,800 people killed, thousands wounded, and tens of thousands displaced, Israel's affording Gazans some much-needed relief. Provided largely by NGOs, hundreds of thousands of tons of goods have passed through this crossing every day during the now 4-week-long war, as they do throughout the year. Here at the Keren Shalom crossing, there's a tremendous amount of action as goods are continuously transferred between Israel and the Gaza Strip. Some 250 trucks will be transferring such things as food, medicine, and basic staples to the people of Gaza who have been hard hit during this operation. But the goodwill is entirely lost on Hamas, which targets this humanitarian crossing point with daily mortar attacks and even sniper fire.
One of the most problematic thing is to explain our people that have to come here and risk their life every morning in order to make sure that the Palestinians get their supplies on time. Why do they have to risk their life on the way here and the way back home and during the operation day?
There is another unique aspect of the brave workforce here. It is comprised of both Israelis and Gazans, one of the only places where members of these two peoples interact on any level.
We make a living here. We work together. There are no differences. It doesn't matter if you are Israeli or from Gaza. It's work.
Widespread criticism has been directed at the Israeli government over the death toll in Gaza, but the Jewish state's concern for the well-being of civilians is apparent when visiting Kerem Shalom, which, perhaps not by coincidence, translates into Vineyard of Peace.
To see these images, and we just, you just said, Mr. Lebanon, why the entire, it was the first reaction, why the entire world is not showing and seeing this, that it is open. And the most ironic thing is that what built these tunnels comes from Israel.
It's not only that. The Israeli military has a unique position. It is called population assistance officers. They accompany the infantry battalions and the armor battalions, and when they get to a town, yes, first they demolish it, but then they help the population. Then they help the population in various needs, and there are really some tragic cases of some wounded kids left by their parents, and the Israeli officers help them, or the elderly, and many other such cases. But if I may just respond to what Ambassador Lebanon said earlier, and he knows it much better. No one should doubt the loyalty of Egypt to the Palestinian cause. Egypt did invade the emerging state of Israel in 1948 for its own interests and against Jordan and for various reasons. However, it has always also served the Palestinian cause, and when Anwar Sadat could have signed a separate peace with Israel, he refused to do it, and he managed to put in the autonomy talks, which led the way to the creation of the Palestinian Authority and will one day create the Palestinian state. So this is an interest, a permanent interest of Egypt, and President Sisi has led the Palestinian cause much better than Ismail Haniyeh or Khalid Mashal.
But Mr. Lebanon, what is Egypt seeking especially behind the scenes?
Where?
Inside
Egypt is,
being a huge part, taking a huge part in this operation, in this crisis particularly.
No, look, there is a huge difference in the Sisi's behavior towards what's going on in Gaza and his predecessor, Morsi. Look, Morsi, although he didn't even mention the name of Israel on his lips and he never talked to any Israeli, he flew to help Hamas. He even sent his prime minister, and we had to hold the fire for that, at the time.
Kandil.
Yes, Kandil. So he was vehemently, let's say, active to save Hamas. We don't see it with Sisi. Sisi is completely different. He has his red lines. The red lines is, first, inland, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is, in his mind, existential. And I believe him.
But also the image of Egypt was really hurt in the so-called Arab Spring. It was really hurt by the demonstrations and the coups and each and everything that happens. Are they trying to rebuild the image in front of the Arab world also on the behalf of the Palestinians?
Look, I think that Egypt has built up again the image inside Egypt after the the election of Sisi, and that the people went into the street, talking about 30 or 40 million, against the Muslim Brotherhood, because it was, a fiasco, the Muslim Brotherhood, the 1 year of the they don't have any idea how, to govern a country. This is an organization who's had a certain ideology, but they don't have the tools, let's say, to govern a country. And Egypt is very difficult to govern. So they were kicked out, and Sisi came. And Sisi reestablished, let's say, the kind of the patriotic pride of Egypt.
But also, Mr. Ambassador, even though you served when Mubarak was in power.
Mubarak, he was nice, Mubarak.
Yes, that was the problem. He was nice, but passive. And Sisi is now going back to the tradition of Nasser and of Sadat in his leadership style. Mubarak was, of course, much better than Morsi. But Mubarak was too passive in his involvement in the peace process.
So let's
I'm teaching.
This is a question, wasn't he?
Look,
what if he would be right now controlling? He would be the president of Egypt, Mubarak. Would it look different? Would this crisis look different?
Yes. We had the crisis, during the time of Mubarak. He sent Omar Suleiman to speak with Hamas and to speak to us, and we reached an agreement and, a kind of a ceasefire or a kind of, I don't know.
Which held for a couple of years.
For a couple of years. He did it. Mubarak did it. But look, Sisi has a different agenda because of the Muslim Brotherhood inside and because that his mind, and this is correct, that the Hamas is an extension. And when you have a certain malady or illness inland and you have a metastasis, in Gaza, you have to deal with this.
What he will do in front of Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who is playing also?
Look, for Sisi, we have to bear in mind that in this round, if the ceasefire will hold, and we're talking about Egyptian success, it is also an Egyptians in front of Qatar and Turkey. Egypt are not keen to see Turkey and Qatar playing a role in this campaign. So if they will succeed, let's say indirectly there are a success against also these two states, one state and a mini-state.
Which will bring them again as a success in front of the allies who are standing next to Iran?
Saudi Arabia, for instance?
They will stand maybe with Saudi Arabia, but Qatar and Turkey are standing by right next to Iran. So.
But the most important fact here is that Washington, under Obama, has been too cool towards Sisi because of the ideals that the United States want to reflect, democracy, free elections, and so forth.
See the latest declaration coming from the State Department.
Right. So they will now have to recognize that Sisi is pivotal in the Middle East, and that this alliance of moderates or perhaps Sunnis versus Shiites and other divisions must be, if not led by Sisi, co-led by Egypt under this regime.
Which is something that I can understand. It's going to be very interesting in the next few days. We can say that Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is giving some really interesting twist.
Maybe he'll give you an interview.
Who knows? Maybe soon.
Maybe he's watching you right now and calls his secretary and says, "Get me Lucy on the phone."
You think?
First of all, wait and see until tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock.
Yes, let's wait and see. Keywords in the Middle East. Wait and see. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for this. And we're going out for a small break, 2-minute break, and then I will be back yet again.
שהתגייס ביקש מלאה אמו ללמד אותו תפירה ורקם בעצמו על רצועת הנשק את המילים עוז וענווה.
احنا بندفع ضريبة القدس، هاي شبابنا، هاي عنواننا.
Welcome back to this special edition of the News Today, and we, of course, continue our extended coverage of Operation Protective Edge. And joining me right now, Dr. Tzvi Bar-El, Middle East analyst for Arts Daily newspaper. Good evening.
Good evening.
And also Reserve Colonel Itamar Yal, Israel's former Deputy National Security Advisor. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you very much for coming. And also Ariel Dlumi, co-director in the Negev Institute for Peace and Development. Good evening. Thank you very much for coming. Dr. Bar-El, let's try to look at it right now with the ceasefire, which will or will not happen tomorrow at 8 a.m. And of course, everybody's waiting for what the jihad will say about us. Mohammed Dif, what he will say about us. Where is the place that Hamas and the Islamic Jihad will find themselves after 8 o'clock tomorrow, if they will respect the ceasefire?
Well, I wouldn't hold my breath right now, because we are talking about 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Why not this midnight? Why not in an hour? It means that there are still some clashes and some misunderstandings and some issues to be discussed right now in Egypt which are not yet completed, and I'm not so sure that they will be completed tomorrow. The fact of the matter is that Egypt has retreated in a way from its original position, meaning that they were saying that first of all there has to be a ceasefire before any dialogue and before any discussions take place. It seems that Egypt is now ready to discuss all kinds of issues without the ceasefire, and I'm not so sure that we are going to have a ceasefire. However, if we have, and we will have a ceasefire tomorrow morning, then it means that Hamas and the Islamic Jihad have agreed on some points that this could be a start of, from their point of view, a starter to the next negotiations. Meaning, we are not yet in the heart of the real negotiations, because the negotiations in Egypt are lacking a prime partner, which is Israel. Israel is not there. Israel will be ready to go to Cairo only on condition that some of its core demands will be met by the delegation. And I don't see that in the course of 2, 3, 4 days, the two parties will embrace each other and say, well, okay, we are happy with your conditions and we are happy with your conditions. So we have to wait and see. However, the ceasefire is important because it will be a kind of a confidence-building measure, if you will, between Israel and Hamas. But it means also that Hamas is kind of grabbing a new status in these negotiations, meaning it is not just that Israel is negotiating with Egypt or negotiating with the Palestinian Authority. Hamas is a partner, and a recognized partner by Egypt and by the others, although Egypt is claiming that it is negotiating only with Mahmoud Abbas.
Mr. Yar, is there any confidence to build between Israel and Hamas? Any confidence left to build between Israel and Hamas?
I assume that there is quite a lot of confidence. The two sides, with all the differences, believe that the other side have not only tactics but also some kind of strategy. Based on this common ground, I think that the two sides can find interest that will be given good answers that will serve the two sides. And I think that the economic future of the Gaza Strip is exactly that. We need to bear in mind the battle that we hold during the last 4 weeks, exactly.
28 days.
Is not only a battle between the IDF and the State of Israel and in the other side the Hamas. There are two players in the other side, and I assume that the Israeli public remember it. One of them is the Hamas, and Israel fought with the Hamas during the last 4 weeks. But there is another player, and this is the Palestinian people, 1.8 million Palestinian people in the other side. And these people suffer. I assume that the Israeli side have done almost, if not everything that could be done, not to target them. But it's clear that every Palestinian casualty is some kind of bad news for the Israeli side as well. So the common ground is the future of the Palestinian people, not the Hamas. The areas that we don't share the same interest are based on the future of the Hamas. I believe that the negotiations in Cairo will have difficulties to agree about the future of the Hamas. Will have less difficulties to agree about the future of Gaza. Again, we need to bear in mind that there are many, many plans that were developed during the years between Israel and the Palestinian side, not the Hamas, but the Palestinian Authority, with different kinds of third parties, beginning with the World Bank, different UN agencies, the American administration, European administrations, the Japanese, and others. So plans you can find, determination to go with them on and to implement them. Perhaps we have now more than we had 4 weeks ago.
Mr. Yar said something here, and also Alon Pinkas at the beginning of this broadcast, that you should just say you're sorry and start acting. You cannot say, we're sorry, but this is Hamas's fault. We're sorry for killing people. It was not the intention. Now it's time for us to rebuild. Now it's time for us to rebuild the trust, to rebuild literally the Gaza Strip. And how do you do that? How do you do that? Do you start by actually going in and providing help, sending money, creating connections with the Europeans, with the US? How do you do it?
So usually what happens in this situation is that we see after humanitarian crisis a very long convoy of international organizations, international humanitarian organizations, the very big ones, but also very small ones. But we know that these times are also very hectic times. And in these times, there is lots of competition between the different organizations, lots of money being wasted during these periods. And we are now exactly at the period of transitioning from the humanitarian crisis intervention into a more longer period of development, of rebuilding Gaza. This is a very challenging situation because what happens the day after the cameras are being shut off? What happens the day after all the reporters are gone? This is where the biggest challenge for Gaza begins, and it has to begin with a very long-term projects to rebuild Gaza. There were, as Itamar said before, many attempts in the past to rebuild Gaza. And there is also lots of lack of trust between Israelis and Palestinians today. I believe that there is a need to create a Gaza Reconstruction Committee that will be assembled by the donating countries, the Western countries, but also countries from the region, countries of the Arab League. They will have to handle this fund and invest in Gaza. Do not build Gaza for the Palestinians. Let the Palestinians build Gaza for themselves.
And I just, before we will continue, just from this exact point, because I want you to see with me the humanitarian situation of the Gaza Strip. 28 days of Operation Protective Edge have caused a humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip. Reports suggest that there are 400,000 refugees whose homes were destroyed. The suffering of the Gazans has brought worldwide condemnation down on Israel and sparked calls for a quick end to the crisis. I-24 News correspondent Ghanin Boulos has more.
The Israeli military operation in the Gaza Strip has chalked up its 28th day. It's another painful day for the families of the victims and for their relatives. But despite their daily reality of bombings and pain, the hope for a better future still exists. The suffering in Gaza takes different forms and colors, from the blockade that prevents residents from leading even the simplest life with dignity and respect, to the number of dead bodies filling the streets.
3 massacres were committed. These massacres have led until this moment to the death of 30 people, for a death toll of 1,742 martyrs until this moment, and more than 9,000 wounded who have arrived to the various hospitals in the Strip. We are talking today about an extremely painful health situation.
Civilians in Gaza do not have anywhere they can call safety. Schools have been bombed, as have other facilities, spurring several human rights organizations to demand an investigation into the Israeli army's bombardment of United Nations and UNRWA facilities. Despite the tragic reality in Gaza and the unbearable life, its residents lead, some continue their efforts to search long and hard for a piece of bread and shelter.
We don't have electricity or flour, and we don't have water. We sleep on the floor. Even mattresses we don't have. They gave each one a blanket, and that's it.
Disappointment from the world is clear on the faces of the Gazans. All that is left for the mothers who lost their children is to raise their hands to God and pray.
They struck our houses, we sleep on the floor, and we barely have enough water. But thank God for UNRWA, which is sheltering us so that Israel can kick us out of our houses and destroy them.
While some people pray to God, others beg the world for help and complain and blame the Arab countries for not standing with them.
There are hundreds of families in UNRWA schools, and they are putting 50 people in one classroom, and still we are not safe. In Bet Hanun, our house was struck. In Jabalia, and that one over there was struck too. Why? Where are the Arab states?
Gaza is crying, and so are its people, as they search for someone to hear their voice. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict still scares innocent children, mothers and elders who are the only victims of these wars.
How do you start explaining this?
You can't really. I mean, this is horrendous. However, I would like to comment on the thing that my colleagues just mentioned. There is an elephant in this room, and nobody seems to see it, because the issue is, yes, about humanitarian aid and reconstruction and donations and what have you. We have seen this kind of donor state, how they really escaped from their duty in Afghanistan and in Iraq and in Syria in the last. But the point is that we are facing a political and an international pressure to solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It's not just about construction. I mean, it is about laying the floor for a more serious, a more intentful negotiations with the Palestinians. And in this, Hamas is a factor. Hamas is not just an organization. It is now part of a unified Palestinian voice, and we have to take it into account, and we have to recognize it. Up till now, Israel has not recognized the unified government of the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. We have to start doing it. Otherwise, we will face the same issue. We will not be, or nobody will be satisfied with just rebuilding Gaza, because you cannot rebuild Gaza without having the Palestinian Authority, and you can't have the Palestinian Authority without Hamas right now.
Yes, Tzvi Bar-El, thank you very, very much for being with us in this part. And of course, we will continue discussing this. I just want to go right now live to our I-24 News correspondent, Eli Hochenberg, who's standing right now in the south of Israel, in the city of Sderot. Eli, what are the latest developments there?
Well, Lucy, the reports on an up-and-coming ceasefire are getting here down south as well, and I cannot say the southern residents are receiving these reports with much satisfaction, because as for now, Lucy, both the aerial and the underground threat from the Gaza Strip is not completely vanished, and they wanted this operation to be over with a certain guarantee that they are not threatened anymore by the rockets or the underground infrastructure in the Gaza Strip, and I am definitely sure that these voices will be heard loudly in the aftermath of this operation if we are indeed heading towards the end. And the tricky part, another tricky part in this twilight time or twilight zone of the operation, Lucy, is that excuse me. So some people, as said earlier, are smelling the end, and hence maybe are using are not following as strictly as they used the orders of the Home Front Command. And you need to understand, southern Israel, the rockets are still coming, so the war here is not over. So the caution measures are still needing to be taken with the seriousness of the first couple couple of days of this operation, so life will be saved as well. And as for now, another day of rockets. In the last hour, it's been relatively quiet, and the residents here are waiting to hear what will be with this current ceasefire agreement.
Yes, Eli Ochenberg, thank you very much for this. Colonel Yar, how do you, first of all, how do you explain this to the people in the south, this ceasefire that it's going to come? Because the people in the south are going to get back to their houses, and at the end, we know that this is not really solved, and the rocket firing and the mortar shells firing will continue to the south. How is Israel going to explain this to the home front?
First of all, I must admit, the expectations of many Israelis were not real, were not, they were in a way naive. Those of us...
Naive, or someone promised them some things that he cannot accomplish?
I think it's a combination of naive and some politicians that used all kind of explanations and excuses, if I may, to try to push the government to directions that they thought are the right directions. I think that from the beginning, those of us that promised the people of the south of Israel that there is a way to make sure that the Hamas will disappear. And in the end of the operation, and doesn't matter how long will it take, they will wake up and the Hamas will disappear, and they will not hear anymore about any kind of threats from Gaza. They really mislead them. Now, I trust most people of the South that they heard it but didn't think that this is the case. Now, I fully agree. They would have liked it to happen, but most of them knew that the chance that this kind of thing will happen is very, very low. I think that the Israeli government need to do now, need to lead two different efforts. One, and I spoke about it already, is to try, together with the Palestinian Authority, to try to rebuild the Gaza Strip, if I may. And on that, as I said, there are plans and projects that you need to take out and begin to develop it and to begin to implement it. But it must be together with the Palestinian Authority and with Egypt. But at the same time, I think that the Israeli government must go for some kind of equivalent project on the south of Israel, mainly the area that surrounded Gaza. It means a lot of money, and I think that if the Israeli government will be brave enough to come to the Israeli public and to tell them, look, we have changed our list of priorities, and we will give these people that suffered for the last 14 years a lot, including during the last month, the Israeli public in general will support it. Now, of course, I don't speak about giving money into the hands of anybody, not in the Israeli side and not on the Palestinian side. We speak about coming out with plans to develop, to help people to create a better economy in both sides. And at least in the Israeli side, the potential is there. I think that most people that live surround us, Gaza don't want money. They want support from the government to do what they need to do by themselves.
Colonel Yar said here something about, in one way, Israel misled the people in the south of Israel by letting them believe or making them believe that at the end of this operation, everything will end and peace will be upon everyone. On the other side, Israel also is misleading the Palestinians, because when Israel is telling the Palestinians on the Gaza Strip, you can go back to your homes in Beit Lahia, the first question that one can ask is, to which homes? Mm-hmm. So we're talking about basically a lot of projects. What kind of projects? How can you underground really help and rebuild the Gaza Strip?
I think that building on lessons learned from previous humanitarian crises in different places around the world, the main issues today is not to rush to build Gaza. It's to stop, to make a serious survey about the needs and
More
also
damage.
about the abilities of the Gaza Strip to rebuild itself. Then when we think about development, we usually think about how to construct the roads, the bridges, the houses, but this is not enough. We also have to think about the people of Gaza, how to create jobs, how to do vocational training, academic training for people, that when the rebuilding process of Gaza ends, then the people of Gaza can take over the factories, all the amenities that have been built over there, and to continue. Now, it's very important that there is also an enabling political atmosphere that will allow these projects to sustain. And I think that Israel has to look at the unity, the national unity government of Palestine, and to work together with this government. Otherwise, these projects will never be sustainable.
So on the other side, Israel will ask, how can you make sure that this time when we're starting to rebuild the Gaza Strip and we're allowing money to pass by and we're allowing goods to get in and we're opening the crosses and the borders, how can we make sure that this time it won't be used against us again, like by missiles and weapons and passing money to terror organizations and to terrorists? What is the solution to this?
So first of all, I have to explain that 99% of the cement, for example, that went into the Gaza Strip was not used to build the terror tunnels into Israel. 99% of the cement was used to build Gaza. There is a risk. The fact that Hamas used some of this cement to build the terror tunnels is not good. I'm not very supportive to this. But at the same time, we have to think about 1.8 million people that have to live over there. This is also why I'm offering to establish an international and regional fund to rebuild Gaza. There will be a professional committee that will be responsible for designing the project, but also to oversight them. Tzvi Barel mentioned before previous events like in Iraq. And we know today that in Iraq, when the US administration ran very fast to invest in Iraq, starting with $2.4 billion and ending up with $60 billion. Today we know that $10 billion were wasted. This time we should not make the mistake of bringing international companies to rebuild Gaza. As I said before, we have to allow the people of Gaza to rebuild Gaza, so more money remains in Gaza itself.
Before we continue, let's hear what the Palestinian Authority has to say about this. And with us from Ramallah, live from Ramallah, is Dr. Abdullah Abdullah, member of the Palestinian Legislative Council. Dr. Abdullah Abdullah, let's put blaming aside, because me and you usually, we start pointing fingers. So let's put blaming aside. How are you planning to help to rebuild the Palestinian, to rebuild the Gaza Strip and to help the Palestinians who are living in Gaza?
You get out, we get in. As long as your occupation is there, we cannot build anything, we cannot produce anything, we cannot develop anything. So if we have to find a solution where you and I can have coffee one day in Jerusalem or in Ramallah or in Jaffa, then we have to end this damn occupation and give our children a chance to live in peace and in a healthy situation.
But Dr. Abdullah Abdullah, even by me asking you to help the Palestinians, you're blaming the Israelis. Just for 1 second, tell me, what are you from your side? Just leave the Israelis just for 1 second aside. Just from your side, how are you planning to help the Palestinians who are living in Gaza?
We are asking you to give us a chance to bury our dead, to heal the wounds of our injured, and then building houses, building the electricity or the water supplies, it will come. As long as you are controlling our lives, it's very difficult to build. And don't try to be humanitarian after what you've done. It will take you centuries, not decades, but centuries, to take away the scar that is left on your conscience.
Again, it's you're blaming us. Again, you're blaming us, me, when you and me. I will say it every time. I am here a journalist, and I'm not the one to blame. But and I'm here to ask you questions.
I know.
So do you see after?
This is a message through you.
Through me to Israel.
I know you are a journalist and you're a respected person.
Thank you very much.
I have no doubt about that. But through you, we have to give our message.
Thank you very much. So just how optimistic are you about the Egyptian initiative?
Yes, we are optimistic, unless you spoiled it as you spoiled the Kerry's negotiation, 9-month long negotiations. If you spoil this initiative, of course, it has no chance. But we are confident. It's us who asked for this initiative. Our president, more than 2 weeks ago, on the 13th of July, and I hope there will be no obstacles in its way to produce a real calm, but has to be followed by dealing with the root cause of the conflict, not to flare up after a year or two, and then we can find peace around the corner. That peace will serve our people and the Israeli people. I am sure that they are victims, as our people are victims, of the arrogance, of the aggressive genocidal war that the leadership is launching, and the American administration is supporting.
Yes, Dr. Abdullah, thank you.
Not for your interest, not for our interest.
Definitely, definitely not the interest of anyone. Thank you very much for this, Dr. Abdullah. We have 40 seconds before we're finishing. 30 seconds, actually. I just wanted to tell you thank you, and I hope that you will come again, and we will expand this talk. And of course, we will have a lot of time to talk more about this. Fortunately, I have today only 2 hours. Thank you very, very much for coming to the studio. And thank you, our viewers, for being with us tonight. Tomorrow, we will be here yet again, the same time, same place, from the Jaffa Port, Israel. Have a great night.